This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day, and that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This podcast contains adult themes and language, and some of the things that we discuss may be disturbing to some listeners. In this podcast, we discuss sexual assault, torture, race, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. Please take care of yourself.
So now let's get into the early life of DeWayne Lee Harris. What do you got, Beth?
Well, DeWayne Lee Harris was born in 1963 in St. Louis, Missouri. According to DeWayne, he was raised in Boston, Massachusetts, then moved to Washington State. He said he grew up in a strict family and his mother would beat him when he got into trouble.
And I'm thinking of the new listeners. So if you're new here, just a quick culture corner. It is not, especially at that time, this is the early 60s when he was born. So he would have been a child in the late 60s and a preteen in the early 70s. And it was not unusual for Black parents to engage in corporal punishment, spanking, beating, to correct their children, because the price of a Black child doing something wrong in public could mean their life. And that's still true to this day. But I was listening to a podcast today about child abuse, and it was two Black pontificators. And the woman who studies child abuse said that the whitest thing you could do is beat your child. Because that was what they did in Europe back in the day, and they brought all those traditions over, and not slave masters, hostage takers and human traffickers, aka slave owners, implemented that kind of discipline, and the practice was carried on. So anyway, I'll shut up about that one. Anyway, Harris said that he was an angry child who was always pissed off. When asked if it was because his mother beat him, he agreed and said that he wasn't close to his mother and that he was closer to his father.
Now, I have to say this is all coming from Harris himself. So
right.
We don't know the veracity of all this, but this is what he said.
Mm-hmm.
He said that he started stealing at the age of 6 and joined the Santana Block Crips in Boston at the age of 12. He was required to put in work to join the gang, meaning that he had to commit crimes to get in. And he admitted to committing many burglaries.
Reportedly, Harris was arrested multiple times for theft, burglary, and rape. Harris claims that he is responsible for other murders as well, and that he killed people when he was with the Santana Block Crips. So now we're going to dive into the timeline. Splish splash, Beth.
In Seattle, an underdeveloped plot of land underneath and along an elevated section of the I-5 and I-90 freeways is known by locals as the Jungle. It's a green belt on Beacon Hill where people experiencing homelessness often camp. The Jungle was described by retired police detective and media personality Joe Kenda as a gathering place for lost souls ignored by society.
Joe Kenda, not familiar with that guy.
You don't know Joe Kenda?
No, girl. Is he, what is?
The homicide hunter.
Joe?
It's an old white cop.
Okay, Joe Kenda. All right. Homicide hunter. Wait a minute. I think I met him at CrimeCon.
Did you?
Maybe not. Maybe he's dead. I don't know.
Maybe he's dead.
I'm getting all my white guys confused. Anyway, where were we? The Jungle consists of 150 acres underneath and along an elevated section of Interstate 5. It's an urban forest with thick blackberry brambles and vines growing among maple and other trees. This sounds like a romance novel scene. Okay. At one point, there was an estimate of more than 400 people in the area living in campsites. But it sounds really pretty.
Yeah, it does.
The way it's
Yeah.
described.
Actually,
Brambles and vines growing among maple and other trees.
Yeah. I actually went on Google Maps and dragged the little person down there to look at the what do you call it?
Street view?
Yes, I dragged it down to Street View so I could look at it.
Oh, did it look? I mean, blackberry
it looks really
brambles.
pretty around there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on September 12th, 1997, the body of 42-year-old Denise Marie Harris, who's no relation to DeWayne Harris, was found in the jungle. Denise was a college-educated preschool teacher battling substance abuse issues. She'd lost her job, and her boyfriend, James Cooper, last saw her when they'd fought and she'd left. Reportedly, she met Harris in downtown Seattle.
Denise had been strangled to death with a belt. Her shoes were missing their laces, and a belt was wrapped around her neck. Her hands and ankles were bound with her shoelaces, but not tightly. The killer had also stuffed a bra in her mouth.
So the shoelaces were not used to tie her up and then he killed her. They were put on her afterwards and not tightly. It's like his thing. He liked doing that. Don't really know why. Yeah.
A signature, but
Right.
I mean, this guy.
All
right.
Yeah.
Guy over here. He sucks.
Investigators found a beer can impaled on the branch of a tree near the body. Her purse was missing and she had no identification, so at first they didn't know who she was. Her clothing was new and she was not dressed in layers, so investigators surmised that she probably wasn't living in the jungle.
Denise was eventually identified by her fingerprints. Everyone investigators spoke with had nice things to say about her, including her boyfriend, who hadn't seen her in a week. He was eventually eliminated as a suspect.
On February 1st, 1998, the skeletal remains of 33-year-old Antoinette Tony Jones were found behind a business, half a mile east from where Denise was found. Medical examiners determined that she'd been dead for at least 3 months.
According to her mother, Tony struggled after her brother, who had served in the First Iraq War and suffered from PTSD, unalived himself. She fell on hard times and spiraled into depression and drug addiction. Oh, also, I was listening to a podcast about suicide, and what the mental health professional was suggesting is when we are talking about language around unaliving oneself, that instead of saying somebody committed suicide, because that makes it sound like the person did something bad,
Right.
that they completed suicide.
I've heard
or
that before,
unalived.
Yeah.
I
Completed suicide.
I
Okay.
thought that was
Good to know.
useful information if
Yeah.
we're talking about this stuff. So
Yeah. I'll have
sorry
to
for
remember
any
that.
triggers, but yeah, I have to remember that too.
Okay. Like Denise, Tony's wrists and ankles had been tied with shoelaces, with an additional one wrapped around her neck. She was dressed in layers of clothing, indicating to investigators that she lived on the streets. A tote bag was found near her body containing papers with her name on them.
On February 1st, 1998, an unhoused man looking for a place to sleep found the body of Olivia Smith, 25, a Native American woman, curled up at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell outside of a business, less than half a mile from where Denise's body had been found. He called for help, and the authorities arrived at the crime scene.
Unlike the other two victims, Olivia had been stabbed repeatedly, and she then bled to death. She'd been stabbed in the chest, 7 times in the buttocks, and her throat was slashed. The way she was dressed, with layered clothing, indicated to investigators that she lived on the streets.
However, one of her shoes was off and untied. Police found this odd because it was the middle of winter and very cold, and there was no reason for her shoe to be removed.
There was no knife at the crime scene, and she had no identification. Olivia was eventually identified by her fingerprints. The man who found her was investigated. He had blood on his clothing, but he told investigators that he'd been in a fight and it wasn't the woman's blood. DNA testing confirmed this, and he was eventually eliminated as a suspect.
Olivia was in a relationship with a man who was abusive, and she filed a protection order against him after he'd threatened to stab and kill her. So he became the prime suspect, but he was also eventually eliminated.
The detective investigating Olivia's murder, Cloyd Steiger, remembered the murder of Denise Harris and the involvement of shoelaces. He theorized that the killer was interrupted when he'd killed Olivia, which is why her shoe had been removed and untied. His MO had been interrupted, and the shoelaces were not used to tie the body up.
Detective Steiger talked to Mike Szynski, the detective handling Denise's case, and the two of them believed that the murders of all three women, Denise, Tony, and Olivia, were connected.
Hi, I'm Sean McCabe.
And I'm Carrie McCabe.
We are, well, married, obviously, but we're also obsessed with the darker side of things.
True crime stories, alien abductions, poltergeists. If it leaves you scratching your head and keeping those lights on at night, we want to hear about it.
That's why we host the podcast, Ain't It Scary, with Sean and Carrie.
Every week, we bring our listeners a true story guaranteed to send chills down your spine. From history's most brutal serial killers to the mystery of spontaneous human combustion.
Yep, lots of these stories leave unanswered questions behind, and you'll get to poke through the rubble of the evidence with a hardened skeptic and
someone whose mind is more open to fun.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
You can find Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie wherever you get your podcasts, and on social media at Ain't It Scary. Come play with us.
The truth about the Haditha massacre has been covered up, but not anymore.
I know you know what happened.
They went into houses and killed women and children.
What are you thinking?
What a mess.
U.S. Marines murdered innocent civilians in cold blood.
And at the center of it all
is 25-year-old Sergeant Frank Wuderick.
And me. Murder in House 2, a new podcast from Crowd Network.
So now, let's get into the investigation and the arrest. Hit it, Beth.
In early 1998, Harris was jailed on an unrelated robbery charge. Then in April of that same year, Harris called a detective out of the blue and claimed to have information about the death of Denise Harris. He offered to lead officers to the real murderer.
So he knew details about the murder of Denise Harris and claimed that he had been with the guy who did it. He wanted a deal, and police kept him talking.
Detective Mike Szynski, who Harris called Mikey Mike, and Detective Cloyd Steiger would pick Harris up at jail each day, take him for a hot dog and a cappuccino, and then have him lead them to different places.
Doesn't this sound irritating to you? Like he just wanted some sort of attention.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll do anything for a hot dog. I love hot dogs.
I mean, I'm sure he was bored and he probably wanted a deal.
Yeah.
So he thought, if he blamed somebody else for this murder, then he would get out of jail. And then they took him for hot dogs and cappuccinos, and he's like, yeah, this is awesome.
Field trips. Yeah, this is great. The only reason why I went to school was for the field trips, and this sounds like something like that. So he took the detectives exactly to the place where Denise had been killed and described the beer can that was impaled on the tree branch by her body. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
He said that he knew where her purse was and then led them to it.
So even in articles in newspapers about this story, a lot of them say that he was with an accomplice when he killed her, but there was no accomplice. I
don't think so either.
Yeah.
I don't think so either.
So, yeah. He also took them to places where the killer was supposedly hiding, such as a bar where the killer supposedly liked to hang out. Then after several days of this, Harris finally said, quote, Mikey Mike, I'm tired of this. Yeah, I killed her. And I killed the one down in the stairwell too, unquote.
Whoa. So Harris told police that he fantasized about murder and he did it because, quote, I just get a thrill for killings, unquote. He said he confessed to the police because he wanted people to know what he had done.
Harris claimed to have been killing his quote-unquote whole life. When asked why he killed, he said, quote, because I could and I wanted to, unquote. He said it was his hobby.
What? His hobby?
His hobby.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Of all the hobbies.
Yeah.
Wow.
Take up woodworking or something.
What, sir? Read a book. Or, I mean, did you hear about, let me go to the setting again. Did you hear about the bumbling blackberry brambles and vines growing around maple and other trees? You could have sat there and read a book.
And it had some blackberries. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Everybody loves blackberries in Washington. It's a thing. Anyway, so according to Harris, he and Olivia Smith were friends. He hadn't planned on killing her, but did when she pulled a knife after a confrontation with him over drugs.
In the meantime, police found a woman who had survived an attack that was stopped by an unhoused man, and she identified Harris as her attacker.
And on May 20th, 1998, Harris was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and was placed in the King County Jail on a $5 million bail.
$5 million? Wow.
$5 million! Wow! So he's never getting out.
Yeah, no.
So let's get into the trial. What the what, Beth?
During his trial, Harris shouted obscenities at the judge and jury, pushed chairs, threw objects, and argued continually with the prosecutor. His behavior during the trial was so bad that they had to strap him to a restraining chair. I have never heard of that before.
It's pretty wild. Now, I will say that the idea of decorum and decency, those are white male colonial standards, right? That we sort of all have. It's a box that we all have to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
However, this is extra.
Wow. Yeah.
This is not like him just being himself. This is so beyond it's outrageous behavior, right? I can't even think of the word. It's just it's out there.
It's more outrageous than outrageous.
Yeah. It's the most outrageous thing ever. Although he had already confessed to killing all 3 women during the trial, Harris recanted, saying that he had killed only one of the victims, Olivia Smith. Harris testified during the trial, quote, "I just snapped. I cannot lie. I snapped. I did kill her. That's the God's truth. I don't have to lie about killing Olivia Smith," unquote.
Prosecutors described Harris as a manipulative predator who preyed on vulnerable women and said that he only confessed for the sake of his ego, as, quote, he wanted Seattle to recognize there was a serial killer, unquote.
Well, after 3 days of deliberations, the jury found Harris guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Denise Marie Harris, Tony Jones, and Olivia Smith. Dressed in jail clothes, he refused to change. Harris threw his head back and laughed when the verdict was read.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Before he was sentenced, Harris told King County Superior Court Judge Marsha Petchman, quote, "Everywhere it's going to be chaos. It's more of us killers," unquote, adding that his imprisonment would not keep her and others safe in their homes and apartments.
What? What? Man, Harris said that justice for the victims and their families could not be served no matter how much prison time he received because he was still alive and still had certain privileges, even in prison. Quote, "I'll still be walking around the prison yard. I still got radios, TV. I'm still going to kick it," unquote. Okay.
This guy is not the sharpest tool in the shed.
I don't even know. Like, oh my, I hate him so much.
I know.
Wow.
The judge told Harris, quote, "I have never run into anyone who has shown the kind of lack of reverence for human life," unquote. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, he cursed and swore at the jury. Oh my God, this guy.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, a big thing about trial, I've been to many trials. A big thing is whether or not the jury likes you, right? Like, you could, in theory, be totally guilty, but if the jury likes you and thinks you're credible, you
could
might
get away
not
with
be
it,
found guilty. Yeah, exactly. And boy, oh boy.
Yeah, not this guy.
Not this guy. So now we're going to get into where are they now? Well, I'll tell you. Harris, good riddance, is currently being housed in the Stafford Creek Correction Center located in Aberdeen, Washington.
In an interview, Harris implied that he could have committed at least 32 other murders, saying, quote, "For 3 bodies, you might get 32 more," unquote. I think he's just full of shit.
blowing smoke.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of smoke, a lot of stories.
Yes, he does.
And who knows what's what.
Ohio is a land of mystery, from missing shipwrecks and lost treasure beneath her surface to strange phenomenon slicing through her skies. From myths that have evolved around historic events and people to the unsolved murders and disappearances that keep her communities wondering what happened. Find Ohio Mysteries on your favorite podcast app, and let's explore the inexplicable. OhioMysteries.com.
What do you think of this case, Beth? Tell us what you think made him snap and your thoughts.
Well, Harris described himself as an angry child, saying he was pissed off all the time. Whatever caused his anger, I don't think he ever dealt with it. It was just living inside of him. And eventually it came out in the form of murder. That's what happens when, well, not for everybody, but for some
there's
people.
a lot of angry people who don't
commit murder.
anybody.
No, but it comes out in weird ways, you know? If you have anger just festering inside of you, it's going to come out in some way or another. For most people, it just comes out in weird ways. Blowing up at people or, you know, just acting like an asshole. Most people don't murder, but this guy murdered.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were a lot of reasons for his anger to fester, including being abused as a child and racism. But again, as always, it's an explanation, not an excuse. And this guy, you know, he took it to extremes.
He really did.
Yeah. And this case was frustrating for me to research because I couldn't find a lot of information about the victims. And I would have liked to have told more about them.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Like Olivia
I tried
was
really hard to get more information.
An Indigenous
about
woman,
her.
right? Yeah. And maybe because of the time of, you know, I don't know why, but I also wish that we had more information about the victims, because I thought as we were reading their names, like grandkids, future kids, like there's so much that's happened since 1997 and 1998 that these women will never get to be a part of. And this motherfucker is still breathing, which is frustrating.
It is.
So
it also makes me really angry that he chose these victims, some of the most vulnerable people in our society, which is common for serial killers. But, you know, just talking about the homeless population and just makes me really mad.
Yeah, me too. I couldn't agree with you more. We both listened to that interview with Harris, and we only know what he told us about his childhood. And he mentioned at one point during the interview that he was neurodivergent as a kid, and he just talked about taking Ritalin in the interview. And he was born in 1963 during the Civil Rights Movement. So his nursery school and junior high years would have been shaped by some big events in the United States, right?
Yeah.
You know, on top of it, the strict parenting and the alleged beatings, we had the assassination of MLK, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton was killed, JFK was killed, the Vietnam War was going on. There was a lot of trauma and turmoil. The government was not trustworthy. And then he also moved out of state several times. And then with his neurodivergence, that's a lot for a young kid. And if the message he might have received was the world hates you and the world is terrible and violent, it makes sense why he was so angry to me, and why he was indifferent towards systems, like why he was cackling in the courtroom. Like he didn't give a shit about the law or rules or anything like that. And he was also really indifferent towards human life. And, you know, he joined a gang. It seemed to me he might have found stability in being a part of a gang. And I think you're right. He never dealt with his anger. It just grew and grew and grew. And he described one of the murders with lots of details. And he talked about blacking out. And then all of a sudden, before he knew it, somebody was stabbed 40 times, right? And it's not an excuse, but to me, there are many explanations for his anger issues. And it's just unfortunate for everybody. Like right now, we know our kids are going to have a hard time in the future because of the trauma of the pandemic.
Right.
And I don't think in the 60s and 70s, people were like, what's the Vietnam War? And what are all these assassinations of leaders going to do to the generation who's watching grown-ups fuck shit up?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And I don't know, maybe that's too woo-woo, but it's a thought I had. And also, again, love and light to the people who lost people they loved in this case, and whose communities are missing members. Beth, where can the people find us?
Our website is fruitloopspod.com, and we use Fruit Loops Pod for all of our social media.
This is a weekly podcast, and new episodes drop every Thursday. So until next time, look alive, y'all. It's crazy out there.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.
3 a.m., the comedy horror podcast that holds weekly gatherings around the campfire. Let me tell you what you're going to get. You're going to hear stories about demonic possessions, prison stabbings, skinwalkers, glitches in the Matrix, cult leaders, missing 411, night marchers, Operation Paperclip, Mesopotamian devil worship, and so many monsters it'll give Kanye West a runaway for his money. Pop and meme culture also aren't off topic. A camp where laughs and scares are constantly competing for first place. We're just a group of friends, trying to bust each other's balls, find the best stories, and expand the circle in the process. 3 a.m., the comedy horror podcast not for the faint or fragile of heart. Let's go.